All right, let's talk about something most people quietly avoid: hard conversations. The conversation with your partner when something feels off. The conversation with a friend who crossed a line. Conversation with a colleague whose behavior keeps creating tension. Or the conversation with your boss about something that has been bothering you for weeks. Most people delay these conversations for the same reason. They feel risky. You don't know how the other person will react. You don't know if things will get better or worse. And sometimes it feels easier to just let it go. But avoiding them rarely creates peace. Because when something important stays unsaid, the mind starts filling the silence. You start replaying moments. You start imagining intentions. You start building stories about what the other person meant. And over time, those stories become heavier than the original problem. A small frustration becomes resentment. A misunderstanding becomes distance. And eventually, the issue that could have been solved with one honest conversation becomes much harder to repair. Welcome to Spark, a place for healing. Today we're going to walk through 9 steps that make hard conversations easier to navigate. Not perfectly, but clearly. So the conversation stops feeling like a confrontation and starts becoming a reset. Let's begin. Step 1. Decide what the conversation is actually for. Before most hard conversations begin, people make a subtle mistake. They know they're upset, they know something needs to be addressed, but they haven't actually decided what they want the conversation to accomplish. And that lack of clarity changes the tone immediately. Because if you walk into a conversation without a goal, emotions take over. For example, imagine someone frustrated with their partner about household responsibilities. They might enter the conversation thinking, I'm going to explain how unfair this has been. But that's not a goal. That's frustration looking for release. A clearer goal might be, I want us to agree on a way to divide these responsibilities so neither of us feels overwhelmed. Now the conversation has a direction. The same principle applies at work. Imagine a colleague who keeps sending incomplete information before meetings. If your goal is to prove they're disorganized, the conversation becomes criticism. But if your goal is to make the workflow smoother, the conversation becomes collaboration. Before any conversation, ask yourself, what will make this successful? Clarity, a change, a boundary. Once the goal is clear, the conversation becomes much easier to navigate. Step 2. Separate what happened from what you made it mean. Our brains are extremely fast at assigning meaning, sometimes too fast. Something small happens and the mind creates a full explanation. Your partner forgets to text. A friend cancels plans. A colleague responds with a short message, and suddenly your mind fills in the blanks. They don't care. They are avoiding me. They are being disrespectful. But those explanations are not facts. They're stories. So before starting a difficult conversation, separate 2 things: what happened and what you think it means. For example, what happened? Your partner didn't respond for 6 hours. What it means? They don't prioritize you. Those are very different things. Instead of saying, you clearly don't care about spending time with me, you might say, I've noticed we canceled the last 3 plans we've made. Facts open conversations. Stories often close them. Step 3. Start softer than the feelings inside you. Many hard conversations fail in the first sentence because emotions build over time. And when the conversation finally starts, the first sentence carries weeks of frustration. You always do this. You never listen. I'm tired of repeating myself. But statements like that trigger defense immediately. Instead, start softer than the feeling inside you. For example, instead of saying, "You never help around the house," try, "I've been feeling overwhelmed lately, and I think we should talk about how we're dividing things." Same issue, very different entry points. Hard conversations rarely fail because of the truth. They fail because of how the truth enters the room. Step 4. Say the thing you're avoiding. Every difficult conversation has one sentence people keep circling around. The real issue. The uncomfortable truth. So people hint at it. They soften it. They talk around it. But if the core issue never gets spoken clearly, nothing actually changes. For example, someone might say, "I feel like things have been a little distant lately." But what they really mean is, "I feel like I am the only one putting effort into this relationship." Or at work, for example, "I think the workflow has been a bit challenging." When what they actually mean is, "I feel like I'm doing most of the work on this project." Once the real sentence enters the room, the conversation becomes real. And once it's real, progress becomes possible. Step 5. Use the phrase, "the story I'm telling myself." There's a phrase that can completely change the tone of a difficult conversation. Entrepreneur Liz Bochanan talks about this idea, and it's incredibly useful. The phrase is, "The story I'm telling myself is," because when something hurts or frustrates you, the mind automatically creates an explanation. And sometimes we present that explanation as if it were a fact. For example, imagine a couple arguing about dishes. One partner might say, "You didn't do the dishes because you think your work is more important than mine." That sounds like an accusation. Now listen to the same concern, expressed differently. "The story I'm telling myself is that you didn't do the dishes because you make more money, and maybe you feel like your time is more valuable than mine." Now something important happens. The interpretation becomes visible, but is presented as a possibility, not as a verdict. And that creates room for clarification. The partner might actually say, "I'm sorry, I actually forgot." Or, "I didn't realize that's how it was landing for you." That phrase turns an accusation into curiosity, and curiosity keeps conversations open. Step 6. Ask a question before making a conclusion. Questions open doors. Statements often close them. For example, instead of telling a friend, "You've been ignoring me," you might say, "I noticed we haven't talked as much recently. Is everything okay?" That question leaves space for explanation. The same principle applies at work. Instead of saying, "You're always late to meetings," you might ask, "I notice you've been joining meetings late recently. Is something making scheduling difficult?" Questions invite context, and sometimes context changes the entire conversation. Step 7. Describe the impact, not the person. When people get frustrated, they often jump from behavior to identity. "You're selfish. You're unreliable. You're impossible to work with." But identity triggers defense. Behavior allows change. For example, instead of saying, "You are unreliable," try, "When deadlines move unexpectedly, it creates pressure for the rest of the team." Or in a relationship, "When plans keep getting canceled, I start feeling like I'm not a priority." Focus on the impact, not the character. Step 8. Turn the conversation towards the future. Many conversations stay stuck in the past. Who said what? What went wrong? Eventually, the conversation needs to move forward. A helpful question is simple. What will make this better going forward? For example, after discussing chores, a couple might say, "How should we divide this so it doesn't keep becoming an issue?" At work, "How should we structure this project so communication is clearer next time?" This moves the conversation from blame to design. Step 9. Accept that clarity is sometimes the real outcome. Not every hard conversation ends perfectly. The other person might disagree. They might need time. They might not change immediately. But even then, the conversation still has value. Because clarity removes uncertainty. And uncertainty drains energy. When something is said openly, the situation becomes real instead of imagined. In reality, even when uncomfortable, is easier to navigate than silent tension. Hard conversations are not signs that something's broken. They're signs that something important is ready to be addressed. The healthiest relationships, friendships, and teams are not the ones that avoid tension. They are the ones that know how to navigate it. So if there is a conversation in your life you've been postponing, maybe the real question isn't how uncomfortable it might be. Maybe the question is, what might improve if that conversation finally happened? Because sometimes the conversation we're most nervous to start is the one that moves things forward. So just do it. That's it for today. Thanks for spending this time with us. If this resonated, take a moment and comment on what your body is learning right now. Naming it is part of the process. Share, like, and comment, and be part of our community. We're Spark Growth, your companion on the path of healing.